Hello and welcome. My name is Olivia Mattis, and I'm so delighted that you've joined us here today. I'm president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, and we honor a great hero, a great rescuer of World War II, whose name was Aristides de Sousa Mendes. He was the Portuguese consul stationed in Bordeaux, France during World War II. And he defied the direct orders of his government to rescue thousands of people from Nazi occupied France. And so we are devoted to his memory and to promoting all stories of rescue, resistance, and moral courage. So today we're telling a story, another French story, and that is the beautiful story of Rose Valland. We are honored to have the filmmaker here today of a film that I hope that you all saw, and we have access to that film until tomorrow at 10 p.m. New York Eastern Time. And we also have a moderator today who's going to introduce our speakers. That's Elizabeth Campbell. Elizabeth Campbell is the director of the Center for Art Collection Ethics at the University of Denver. She's the founder and director. She's also in the film that you saw. And her job as the moderator is going to be to introduce our speakers and to moderate your questions when it comes to the Q&A period towards the end of the hour. So do be thinking of questions and typing them into the chat box. We don't recognize raised hands. We ask for everybody to simply type out their questions in the chat box. And Elizabeth, I'm sure will get to as many as she can. So Elizabeth, I'm so delighted to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia. It's really an honor to be here today. I'm so pleased that we were able to take advantage of the virtual platform to assemble this very impressive panel of experts. And in particular, it's so wonderful to see Brigitte, at least virtually. It was such a pleasure to be a part of her impressive documentary. We conducted the interview at the Louvre in Paris, and it really has been a highlight of my career. So I've greatly enjoyed revisiting the project, and I'm very pleased to be here today. So each of our panelists will say a few words, and I will introduce each one before they speak. So let's start with Mary Kate Cleary. She's an art historian and lecturer specializing in restitution and repatriation. She has worked for over a decade with heirs of families persecuted in the Holocaust, as well as with museums, auction houses, commercial galleries, and private collectors, including in the resolution of dozens of Nazi-era restitution claims. She also has lectured widely and is currently a lecturer of art business at Sotheby's Institute in London. She also taught an innovative course on provenance research at New York University, which is quite rare in American higher education. She also has worked at various institutions, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Art Loss Register, artnet.com, and New York's Jewish Museum. Mary Kate will be providing some historical context for our discussion today. So welcome, Mary Kate.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that introduction. And thank you to Olivia and to the Sousa Mendes Foundation for inviting me to take part. I'm very honored. And I think I'm just going to share some slides as I tell you a bit of historic context. Obviously, we all had the chance to see, hopefully, this really tremendous film by Brigitte, and I'm very honored to be taking part in an event that discusses and gives us a chance to engage with her film. But to give us a background into some of the themes and the issues that the film helps us address, and to remind us of what these might be, I just thought it would be helpful for us to think through the kinds of cultural property transfers that happened during and just before and after the Nazi regime's existence in Europe. And you can see here, I have a slide addressing these kinds of transfers. And I use transfers instead of just saying looted art or stolen art, because really this work was spoliated or removed from its rightful owners in all kinds of different ways. So we see cultural defamation. Some of us might be familiar with the fact that the Nazis had a real sense of what taste was acceptable and what works of art were actually against their ideology. And in that vein, they were aggressive against artists who created art in a way that would have been modern or abstract, or in some way against the political sensibilities of the Nazi regime. That also included, of course, makers, artists who were enemies of their ideology, which included Jewish artists as well as communist artists. Artists who in some way lived outside of the mainstream. So that's the one that we're maybe familiar with in terms of their taste. But beyond that first attempt to consolidate what was good culture and bad culture in Germany, when the Nazis started to engage in the occupations of the Second World War of nations outside of what had first constituted Germany, they engaged in what we might call collecting. And this came in all kinds of forms. That was legal acquisition, illegal acquisition, buying, stealing. And one of the main arms of this activity was the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which we heard quite a bit about in in Brigitte's film. So we know that that term, Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, is about the special task force of a man called Alfred Rosenberg. And I think it's a good moment to just clarify for us for this evening that we have two Rosenbergs who are in question and who we'll be dealing with. Alfred Rosenberg was a Nazi cultural official. Paul Rosenberg was a Jewish French art dealer who we'll get to hear from his granddaughter shortly. So just to remember that this is the first Alfred Rosenberg. So he had this activity of trying to systematically loot Jewish collections, as well as find cultural property that was of interest to the Nazis. We also saw the experience of forced sales of Jewish-owned collections, the abandonment of property following emigration, Jewish-owned art galleries within Germany and in occupied territories were Aryanized, so they were forced to be handed over to non-Jewish operators of their business. And then after the war, you have military spoliation in the zones of occupation. This particularly affected the Russian zone, the Soviet zone of occupation, where there was a consideration that any of the property that could be taken back to the Soviet Union would count as war booty, as a kind of a reparation against the losses of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, this is a problematic idea to begin with, but unfortunately, much Jewish property that had been looted from out with Germany actually got caught up in this process. And we have images there that might be familiar to us a bit from Brigitte's film, of in the top right, Hitler's Dream Museum in Linz that was never built. This is where he was going to put a lot of the looted art. In the bottom right, we have Hermann Göring, the number 2 to Hitler, coming out of the Galerie Goudsticker in Amsterdam. So he spent much of his war actually looking to enrich himself personally, also with works of art. In the middle, an auction that was taking place outside of a Jewish home on the street. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see a bigger image of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg map, the extent to which they engaged in this looting. This special task force, as I said, was headed by Alfred Rosenberg, and France was the first country of interest to Rosenberg's looting units. And though this figure, is very approximate, because many researchers come up with different amounts depending on how we consider it, just to give you a sense of the extent of this looting in France, the ERR looted more than 21,000, maybe several thousand more individual objects from over 200 Jewish-owned collections in France. And next slide, please. And the subject of this evening's conversation, Rose Valland. In October 1940, during the occupation of Paris, the Nazis commandeered the Jeu de Paume Museum and converted it into the headquarters of the ERR. Valland remained in her role at the museum and began to spy on the Nazi theft operation that we learned about in Brigitte's film. She eavesdropped on German conversations and kept meticulous secret notes on the destinations of train car shipments that were filled with looted art. She witnessed the frequent visits of Hermann Göring, who made more than 20 separate visits to the Jeu de Paume, where looted collections were kept. The Nazis remained unaware that Valland understood German, enabling her to gather critical information from conversations of drivers, guards, packers, which she ultimately relayed to the French resistance. And you see there an image that we can read through this image a lot of the activity that took place, the crimes that were perpetrated by the Nazi collaborators and collaborating art dealers in Paris. Hermann Göring sitting with a very small Dutch landscape in his hands that's being offered to him by the art dealer stood above him, Walter Andreas Hofer. And then in front of him, the collaborating art dealer Bruno Lose, who at the Jeu de Paume there is holding two works by the French artist, avant-garde artist, Henri Matisse. We see a still life with flowers and a table and some paintings. And then on the right, we see an odalisque, or an orientalized figure. And both of these works belonged to the collection of Paul Rosenberg. And they are being offered in trade. So the Nazi officials have seized these works from Jewish collections. They've consolidated them at the Jeu de Paume in Paris, and they are offering them to Parisian art dealers willing to collaborate in exchange for the works that actually meet the Nazi taste. So there's a lot going on here that helps us document and understand these transactions. And the next slide, please. And we know that Rose Valland becomes very important herself in documenting these transactions at the Jeu de Paume. She actually then becomes a monuments woman, which we learn later. And so to unpick these transactions, we know that the monuments men were a group of approximately 345 men and women from 13 countries, most of whom volunteered for service in the newly created MFAA, the Monuments, Fine Art and Archives section of the Allied military forces during World War II. Many had expertise as museum directors, curators, art historians, artists, architects, and educators. And this group worked to protect monuments and to protect works of art during the war. But then after the war, they had the additional task of trying to unpick all of this looting. And we have an image here that's actually a bit of a red herring, but I think it gives you good context as to where these works were found in mines, in storage areas. In Germany, we have American soldiers rescuing Edouard Manet's In the Winter Garden. In fact, this work came from the German state collections in Berlin. So this wasn't a work that was actually stolen, looted, and then recovered. But you can see there is a propaganda to the Monuments Men efforts as well. So that gives you a bit of the context of what leads us up to Valland's incredible story. So I'll leave it there and hand back over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Mary Kate, for that very important historical background that helps to provide context for Brigitte's film. And next we will hear from Brigitte herself, the director of Rose Valland, The Art Spy. The French title of the film is L'espion au tableau, Rose Valland face au pillage nazi. Brigitte studied at the Centre de Formation des Journalistes in Paris and has directed numerous short films for French television, for CanalPlus, TF1, France 2, and is now an independent documentary filmmaker. She's directed around 20 full-length documentaries, and her main areas of interest are ecology, politics, and women's history. She teaches filmmaking at the University of Rennes in Brittany and has served on the jury of various film festivals. It's really wonderful to hear directly from you, Brigitte. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you to the audience. And please apologize my very bad English. I lack of practice. So it's a pleasure to share with you this history. I was not a specialist of this period, but as I could talk German, a producer asked me to work on this story, Rose Valland, and I never heard of her anyway in any French books of history, never heard of this amazing woman. And as I discovered her role, her work, which was so important in this looting of works of art, I was asking to myself why I've never heard of her before. That was for me huge mystery. So I try to understand this. And when I work on this story, it was 2010, and it was the beginning of her comeback because 2 different books were released about her, and also 2 comic books. And I tried to work on these little pieces, but no one that filmed her anyway. And anyhow, I have found no film of her, and she died in 80. So it was very amazing that nobody took a camera and filmed her and asked her questions about what she did. And now I'm happy to see that little by little, this woman is a little bit well known through my film, also through other works. And I went to this new street. It was Rose Valland Street, which has been named Rose Valland. It was 5 years ago, but it was very new that this woman was publicly recognized in France. And I was happy of that, so I make a little picture for you. But of course, it is not a huge boulevard. It's a bit more like a dead-end road in the Paris suburbs, a very small street. And through this film, I tried to understand why was she forgotten. And I have 2 main answers about this question, and it is one, because she was a woman, because every woman of this age, of this generation, was not recognized at all. And a second explanation, but maybe you won't agree with me, but we can have a discussion about this. I think the French museums were so happy to have these paintings, so they didn't want Rose Valland to be, brought up and honored for her work. That's my explanation. So now I think if you have questions, I can answer.
Brigitte, there is a comic book, isn't there?
Yes, yeah. 2 comic books were released on her life. That was 1 or 2 years ago, before I released the film. And that, yes, it's a good thing. But, in these comic books, they don't tell the whole story. And I try to for example, in one of these comic books, didn't talk about her being homosexual. I don't know why. Maybe because they want to sell it to children. I don't know. Yeah. But she was also a character in 2 major fiction films, Rose Valland, one in The Train from Frankenheimer, and the second one in Monuments Men, made by George Clooney. And these 2 films, the whole character of Rose Valland was not completely unfolded, unfortunately.
That's a good point, and one that perhaps we'll be able to return to in the question and answer period. But thank you so much, Brigitte. It's fascinating to hear your perspective and the fact that you, as a French engaged filmmaker, had not known of Rose Valland before working on this project. So thanks very much for that background. Now we're going to hear from Marianne Rosenberg, the owner of Rosenberg and Company, a gallery in New York that continues her family's distinguished tradition of exhibiting modern and contemporary art. She's a granddaughter of Paul Rosenberg, the legendary Parisian art dealer who fled France in 1940 thanks to a visa from Aristides de Souza Mendes, and whose gallery and collection were plundered by the Nazis. Many of the artworks looted from the Rosenberg collection were taken to the Jeu de Paume Museum, where Rose Valland tracked Nazi operations at great personal risk. Welcome, Marianne.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure and a hard act to follow after Mary, Kate, and Brigitte, but I think this is a perfect setting to discuss Rose Valland. I mean, we are dealing with, in the foundation of Sousa Mendes and Rose Valland, here are two people who stepped up from what was their designated roles and became something way greater than that. Sousa Mendes, of course, set out to, in his words, save humanity and issued these visas to thousands of people, be they Jewish, communist, stateless, and so forth. And Rose Valland, in her little administrative role initially, steps up to be this person who initially quested to save French culture with a capital C as she saw it. So my story is going to be to recount how Rose Valland's path intersected with my grandfather Paul's path, and in a very strange way with my father Alexandre's path. So Michael, if you can put up the slides. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is a photograph of Paul Rosenberg, my grandfather, taken many moons ago, shortly after he opened the Galerie Paul Rosenberg in Paris, Rue La Boétie. My great-grandfather had actually started the gallery in 1878 in Paris, and then passed it on to Paul and his brother Léonce. Next slide, please. Okay, this was the ground floor of La Galerie Paul Rosenberg, and that at the floor had traditional, quote unquote, French paintings. You can see an Ingres, Corot, and Courbet, and so forth. If you go to the next slide, it will show, however, that upstairs, my grandfather had become the dealer to a number of then contemporary great artists. So in the back of the photograph, you can see a few paintings by Picasso. On the left, extreme left, a few still lifes by Braque. And in the middle, a number of paintings by Marie Laurencin, a woman painter whom he had signed on as early as 1917. Next slide, please. Okay, most galleries at that time were not as established as they now are. And there was a sort of a fluidity between what the owner had as in his collection and what was properly the gallery. Not so with my grandfather. Every piece that came in got an inventory card, of which you have two samples here. And they were the size of those cards that some of us remember seeing in libraries. They had a black and white photograph stapled or glued to them with the image of the work. They had an inventory number, and they had the provenance of the painting and its dimensions and the name of the painting. So this occurred to everyone, including, next slide, please, a painting that you may have seen occasionally, which is now in the Museum of Modern Art, and that painting was item 3770 in the inventory. So in the course of his show, he had developed very strong relationships with many artists, including Picasso, who lived next door. Next slide, please. And this is an example. It has the inventory card, and it brings up something that we can address later, is even with the lists and all of these inventory cards and all the information, we see here the beginning of the problem, which is that this painting is commonly known as the Three Musicians. It's in the Museum of Modern Art. But if you look at the little inventory card from my grandfather, it says Picasso, Les Trois Masques, the Three Masks. And yet it is exactly the same painting. So in next slide, please. My grandfather also represented Braque. And here is some photos of an exhibition, Braque at the Galerie Paul Rosenberg. And a little bit later, he started to represent Fernand Léger. Here we have an image of this absolutely stunning painting, which is also in the MoMA. And on the right side, you can see some of these inventory cards and the one that corresponds to this painting, again, with its provenance and its dimensions. And then lastly, my grandfather, starting in 1936, began to represent Matisse. And here you have an absolutely staggering wall of Matisse's at Paul Rosenberg. We're starting in 37, 38, and 39. My grandfather stopped acquiring works that were to be kept in France. He sensed that the war was coming and wrote a letter to the other art dealers in Paris saying, do not acquire anything from these degenerate art sales that Mary Kate evoked that will come back on our heads as bomb. Very prescient commentary. And he began sending massive amounts of inventory off to quote unquote special exhibitions. So some went to the UK, many of them went to the States, many of them to Latin America, and yes, even so far as Australia. And one of the most important ones is the 1939 Picasso exhibit at MoMA, where my grandfather loaned about 40 Picasso paintings. Those paintings obviously stayed in the United States during the war. And then when World War II breaks out, the family has closed the gallery already in 1939. They are briefly in tour, and then they go down to Bordeaux, along with 1.5 million other refugees. And it is there that gratefully the family received 17 visas to leave France, of which 14 were used. We'll see that the one that belonged to my father and his first 2 cousins were unfortunately not able to be used. So the visa that my grandfather received, next slide, please. Here is the image of my grandfather looking much less snappy than he did in the earlier pictures, and the visa with Sousa Mendes's signature on the right. When he got to the States, everything that had been left in France, the French government decided was deemed to be abandoned property and could be seized. And this culminated later on when in 1942, my grandfather was informed that he had been lost his French nationality. This was a very momentous moment for him because he had built up French art and the French culture as the center of his gallery. This is a telegram where my grandfather, in somewhat humoristic and at the same time kind of pathetic way, sends a cable to Vichy government saying that he protests vigorously of having his nationality taken away from him. But it did permit the German authorities and the Vichy people, to the extent they needed it, to hide behind the fact that he was not French and had abandoned his property. So what happens to my grandfather's inventory during that time? It was in 3 locations. It was in Paris, Rue La Boétie. This is what happens to that building in Rue La Boétie. It is taken over as soon as the 4th of July of 1940. It then is handed over to the Gestapo shortly thereafter, and it becomes in April, June, July 1941, the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question, which was a propaganda arm, which then created these exhibitions of how to distinguish a French person from a Jew and other very savory titles of that sort. We see where the Picassos were hanging. We now see a portrait of Pétain and so forth. In the next slide, we see an invitation to join the Institute, saying, careful, that's burning, let's blow this all out, referring to Judaism, and has my grandfather's address at the bottom. Next slide, please. As Mary Kate pointed out, the head of the looting was unfortunately called Rosenberg as well. Once again, no relation to us, I can quite assure you. So what happened to the things that were in Paris? Next slide, please. Those went into the Louvre. This image, which is stunning, is of my grandfather's possessions, the family possessions in the Louvre. So not in the Jeu de Paume, but in the Louvre, which is adjacent. And these are not paintings. These are mirrors and furniture and all sorts of things because they stole everything. The next place where things were stored was near Bordeaux in Florac, where the large part of the family was, and they had rented this semi-chateau house in Florac and had stored lots of paintings there. What was stored there was denounced literally the day after they left. When they fled, the fleeing was on the 19th of June, and on the 20th, everything was stolen from Florac. The third place was that while he was in Bordeaux, Paul went and found a vault of appropriate size, not in Bordeaux because that was impossible, but in Libourne. And that wasn't looted until September 5, 1941, so somewhat late in the process. The vault was not in Paul Rosenberg's name, it was in his chauffeur's name, but it was denounced in exchange for a few pizarros. And here we have the minutes of the breaking into the vault on the letterhead of the bank, and then co-stamped by the German eagle at the bottom. So here are massive amounts of things. Those all went to the Jeu de Paume. Next slide, please. And in this room that Rose Valland appropriately named La Salle des Martyrs, the room of the martyrs, which we call this room of degenerate art, you can see in the back a Picasso, a nude of a woman washing her foot. That's a Rosenberg painting. On the right-hand side, you see a large Léger, and up a little bit to the left, one more cubist there as well. And on the floor, you see on the front left, you see a number of Marie Laurencint's work. All of these were deemed degenerate and were taken and were in this room. There was a lot of things they took also that was not in this room, but this is sort of very poignant to see. And in the same slide that Mary Kate showed you, some of the works like these Matisse, I find this particularly chilling to see Goering looking at paintings that belonged to my grandfather and which he had picked out of Matisse's studio. So what happened to these works? Obviously, Rose Valland is making lists of it, but the Germans are making lists as well. And they had their own inventory cards. And here's an example. This was a Van Gogh that belonged to my grandfather. And again, it had several names to it. And then on the right, you see the ERR card, which gives it a different inventory number, PR for Paul Rosenberg, 144, and may describe it differently, may even give it different sizes because it was just a lot to be done and so forth. So we begin to see how complicated this can get. During that time, when they fled France, as I mentioned, my father and his first two cousins were pulled out of the car and were not allowed to leave France because they were over 17, even though the French army had already collapsed. He was able to leave on the last Polish boat leaving France and got to the UK. And he was one of the original 20 officers with de Gaulle in the Free French Forces. Let's not go into where he was during the war. It's a complicated story. He was in Africa in every way, then brought back, Utah Beach Liberation Paris. But what's important is that my father was in the 2nd Armored Division, the Deuxième Division Blindée, which was the most elite troops of artillery. And they were the ones given the honor of entering Paris. So they entered on the 24th of August. And on the 25th, he was still fighting. On the 26th, he went to see if he could find family members. And this extraordinary photo of my grandfather was taken when he drove up and found actually some family members, which we see here. That's my father driving the Jeep. Again, he is not American, even though he's equipped and supplied. He is in the Free French Forces. And that is Edmond, Paul's brother. And then the two other people are two of my father's first cousin. When they get to Paris, the head of the Deuxième Division, the 2nd Armored Division, tells them that there are two things they must do. One is go and take the swastika off the Eiffel Tower. And my father told me that there was a great burst of patriotism and he decided not to volunteer. He told me, I had crossed the Sahara Desert. I was damned if I was going to go up the Eiffel Tower. I knew the elevators didn't work. So instead, he volunteered to stop what he had been told was the last train of hostages leaving Paris. And he took a group of men, not a lot, and they attacked the train. The train did not have any hostages, mercifully, but it was a train full of things that the Germans wanted to take, furniture, art, pots and pans, whatever. And amongst them was art and a large portion of the Rosenberg inventory and collection. Next slide, Michael, thank you. And this is the list of the items belonging to Paul Rosenberg that were found in that train by my father in a small twist of fate. This is the beginning, by the way, of the family realizing the extent of the looting. This was made, as Brigitte alluded to, into a movie called The Train by Frankenheimer. Burt Lancaster sort of kind of plays my father, although he's in the Resistance, my father was not. And Rose Valland makes a very minimal appearance, unfortunately. From that moment on, the family worked with Rose Valland in trying to combine lists of things that have been lost. Next slide, please. And this is a list made by Edmond, you saw in the picture, Paul's brother, which he sends to the Commission of Artistic Recuperation in France as late as 47, listing the thousands of works that had been looted and lost. And this list, he had worked with Rose Valland, who had her own list, as we well know. And even after the war, Rose Valland continued to work on behalf of the family and with the family. And in my last slide, I just wanted to select out one example of a letter that Rose Valland wrote, is late in 59, mentioning and trying to straighten out the ownership of a vieille that had been looted from us and whom it belonged to. So this was a long collaboration between Rose Valland and the Rosenberg family, who are obviously grateful. And I'm going to hand back to Mary Kate, who can give us a lot more information on this.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I really don't know how to follow that. That was such an incredibly compelling and really meaningful look into your grandfather's life, his experience, and really gives us a sense of how we can watch the arc of this narrative play out through one collection and all of the contributions that the research of Rose Valland actually had made, as well as some of the unanswered questions and the problems that still exist in sorting through and reckoning with this past today. So what I'll do now is, if Michael will share the slides again kindly, just give us a sense of how the research process goes today for the provenance research into works of art that were looted by the Nazis and that were recovered or were not recovered by the French. And so I've just brought us back into this narrative through looking at an image of American soldiers with looted paintings at Neuschwanstein Castle in Germany. And this was actually a very special image I wanted to show because it relates to Valland's contributions so intimately. She traced the sending of hundreds of crates of looted works of art from French collections being sent surreptitiously. And we saw this in Brigitte's film, that not even the Nazi high command necessarily knew where these works were being sent. And Valland was able to trace that. And one of the sites was at Neuschwanstein, which is near a village called Füssen in Bavaria in Germany. Next slide, please, Michael. And we see there in this next slide, Rose Valland together with the American monuments woman, Edith Standen, and they're there next to some cultural property, armor, a painting, a sort of sculptural skull that Standen is holding in Wiesbaden, which was another of these sites where the works were sorted through after the Allies identified the storage areas where works were being held. They took it upon themselves to try to think through how all of this cultural property that had been brought to Germany was going to be redistributed to the countries of ownership, but also those countries would then have to work through this property to give it back to the rightful individual private citizens. So we can move to the next slide. And I thought I would show you how, I mean, this is a slide sort of giving us a summary of Valland's work. As I mentioned, most prominently, she discovered and traced the works going to Neuschwanstein. I talked already a bit about the 20,000 works of art and cultural objects that were stolen, at least from Jewish private collections in France, including the Rothschilds, the David Vai collection, Alphonse Kahn, the Bernheim-Jeune brothers, who were collaborators working as art dealers with Paul Rosenberg in the 19 teens and 20s, very prominently as avant-garde dealers. So these were really prominent collections that were looted, and Valland secretly, as we know, gathered notes that were instrumental in identifying where these works had ended up after the war. As we learned from Brigitte's film, Valland received a commission into the French First Army on the 4th of May, 1945. She heads to Germany and she actually works as a monuments woman, working through and trying to identify the works that had been spoliated and taken from collections. She then works together with a newly formed organization called the French Commission on Art Recovery, the Commission de Récupération Artistique, which is based in Paris, which is working to return and receive back to France the works stolen from the French state, but also from French private collections. And in honor of that work, the French state has named the website where it keeps records of works that were returned to France, but for whom no rightful owners could be identified. And this project, as we learned, is called the Musée National Récupération, or the MNR. This collection is difficult and problematic for the French state because after the war, while great efforts were made to return works to France, and many private citizens received their collections and their works back, there was this legacy of around 16,000 works that fell under a decree that the French state could pick from these works what they felt was valuable, and those would be integrated into the state collections. Now, these were works where they could not identify the owners at that time. Now, there's a question as to how hard they tried to identify these owners. So those works, 2,000 were selected and 14,000 were actually auctioned off. So this site, while it is a problematic legacy, it bears Rose Valland's name in honor of her work to identify where these works had gone when they were stolen. So we'll just go to the next slide. And thinking through her legacy and tracing this, we saw Marianne telling us about her grandfather, Paul Rosenberg, and Marianne's very kindly allowed me to take you through that process of reconstruction. So we have an image of Rosenberg there and his gallery at Rue Les Boésies, a Toulouse-Lautrec show from 1914. And then I'll bring us back to one of these central images in the next slide of the salle de matière, this picture of Rose Valland in this degenerate art, this avant-garde rejected art by the Nazis. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see, unfortunately, in the one with Valland, you can't quite see this far over, but I want us to focus on this drawing by Picasso on the right that I've circled for you there. And if we go to the next slide, we can see the Nazis themselves at the Louvre, and the Jeu de Paume in particular, made these cards, these image cards for the works that they intook. And you see there that they've documented from whom it was taken. And in the next slide, we can see an even more detailed inventory card where Nazi officials who were art historians were asked to assess this card. And we see actually a female art historian who's annotated there as Dr. Tom. She ends up looking at this work and creating a card for it saying when it was taken in, that it's by Picasso. We have a German description, which, as Marianne said, it's difficult to know how works are described anyway, never mind if we have them described in 3 languages. So stehender weiblicher Akt, a standing nude on the edge of a sea, we see there. And if we just go to the next, and we see it's marked as being from Paul Rosenberg's collection. And I'll just make a note here that these documents that come from archives really internationally, from NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration in the United States, as well as having a set held in the Federal Archives in Germany. These have been brought together by a really tremendous project called the ERR project, which was funded by a number of organizations and headed up by a historian named Mark Mazerovsky. And this is something, the funding mostly coming from the Jewish Claims Conference, has been a really important project for provenance research. So we start there with that kind of basic provenance of the actual documents made by the Nazis. And then we can see how Rose Valland's research fits into this. If I wanted to trace what happened to this painting, in the next slide, you can see I would start by going to the French National Archives. Today, a lot of the documents that were previously held in the Louvre archives have been moved to the French National Archives, and we see this collection of works from Jewish collections that were taken during the war. That is the documentation of Rose Valland. So if we go to the next slide, we can see on a particular visit, I was looking to reconstruct the history of a different work, and you see there I can find the actual notes that Rose Valland took on the train de Aulnay, is what it's been come to be known as in research history. This is where the train was stopped, the site just outside Paris. And you see her trying to write down exactly what she was finding in these crates. As Marianne Rosenberg's father was stopping the train, Rose Valland then arrived to write down what was there in the crates. And in the next slide, we can see, if I would be looking for this Picasso, did Rose Valland find that on the train? The slide, Marianne had also shown us this list. If we go then to the diplomatic archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Paris, we can actually see all of Valland's notes that she took in her work in Germany, identifying the looted works. And these are copies held of those lists that she identified on the train before it left Paris. And these works were restituted to Paul Rosenberg. So if we look at Rosenberg's vast collection of thousands of works that were looted, we can try to reconstruct we can successfully reconstruct what was restituted in the immediate post-war era. And we could go into much depth of this really tremendous story of how Paul Rosenberg is a paradigm for restitution and how he achieved this in a way that is incredibly heroic. But we also can look through and determine that certain works were never found because of those images that we saw, where we see the dealers coming to the Jeu de Paume and dealing in these trades. So if we move to the next slide, we can see that even though we don't identify, and I can say that that drawing by Picasso is still missing, it's not identified by Valland. She continues to try to help Rosenberg. We see her writing. This is in Paul Rosenberg's private archives, which are now held by the Museum of Modern Art in New York after the generous donation of Marianne's family. You can access these and read about Valland trying to help with the Rosenberg collection to try to continue to work toward reconstructing it, and Paul Rosenberg acting as a sort of agent of restitution, bringing together monuments men from the United States where he emigrated. And we can see that persisting into, I think this is dated 1955. So really until the end of his life, he was engaged in this. And we can follow that through the archives and see how Rose Valland's work is still important for us today. And then there, just ending on, if you want to read more and see the inspiration for the train and for some of Brigitte's work, you can look at Rose Valland's book itself, which is still in publication. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary Kate. Thank you to all our speakers. We will have Q&A, so I do encourage you to continue putting your questions into the chat box. Right now, I'm just going to borrow the floor for a minute to tell you a little bit about upcoming programs of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So we honor all kinds of rescuers and resistance heroes, and we focus on many different countries and subjects. We really have very varied programs and speakers and films, and I hope that you will take advantage of that. So next Sunday, we are featuring a film called Shimon's Returns, and it features the story of an Israeli history professor named Shimon Redlich, who goes back to the Ukraine and to Poland, the two countries where he was hidden during World War II. And he meets and thanks his rescuers. So it's a very poignant film made by the great filmmaker Slavomir Grunberg. We have the filmmaker with us, and we have Mr. Redlich himself joining us from Israel. That program will be moderated by Richard Horowitz, who is coming out with a book soon from HarperCollins on rescue during the Holocaust. So that is next week. The discussion is free, but there's a little bit of a film rental cost. So you sign up for it, and then we will send you the information on how to access the film. The week following, we are telling an extraordinary story, and this is a story that everyone should know. It's the story of Roddy Edmonds, who is the only American soldier ever to be named righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. And really, this is a breathtaking story. We have Mr. Edmonds' son with us, Pastor Chris Edmonds. And we also have Stanley Stahl, who's the director of the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous. And I've been wanting to collaborate with her, and what a perfect story on which to collaborate. So that is a completely free program, and I hope you all sign up. We have room for 1,000 people on our Zoom account, so I hope to fill the room for that program. The following week is March 13th, and there we have an unusual program. It's called Shalom China. We had a previous program called Shalom Uganda. This one is Shalom China. We have one coming up in a few months called Jewish Jamaica. So we're looking at the Jewish presence in different parts of the world. Nothing to do with the Holocaust, but of interest to anyone who is fascinated by Jewish history. So again, that is a free program, Shalom China, on March 13th. And then the following week, March 20th, we look at the American response to the Holocaust, and we're focusing in on a hero, a figure named Peter Bergson, who did everything he could to try to persuade the US government to make it a war aim to rescue Jews during the Holocaust. And of course, it's a big question as to whether he succeeded or failed. Ultimately, there was the War Refugee Board that came into existence in 1944, and many believe that that's as a result of the efforts of Peter Bergson. So that's another program that I hope you will join us for. And just like for today's program, there are tickets for that particular program. And all of the information will be in the email that you will receive this afternoon after today's program is done. So now I'm going to turn the floor back to Elizabeth Campbell, who's going to monitor the question period.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you to all of our audience members who have submitted some fascinating questions in the chat. We have time to just take a few of them. So we're going to be prioritizing the questions that really directly relate to the film and Rose Valland. Mary asked a good question for Brigitte that Brigitte answered very briefly in the chat, but I think it would be interesting for all of us to hear a bit more about how you obtained the historical footage of the works being transferred. I'm also fascinated by that audio clip of Rose Valland that's in the film. We might not have her on film, but you hear that audio and a sense of the cadence of her voice and her personality comes through. So where did you find that historical footage?
This footage, you mean the one where we can see the packing of the art? It was, it's not a real footage. It was, how do you say, mise en scène? Staging by us. I don't know, actually. I found it on the internet, and it was American source, and it was a reconstruction of the story, and but it was helpful for me for the film. So, but it's not a real archive. I think no camera was really at the Jeu de Paume at that time. Only not moving pictures. I mean, just pictures. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the audio, I found it was in the official French radio archives, which are public. And it was really interesting because with a voice, you can see how sophisticated she was, or maybe she was trying also to hide a personality which was, she was coming from a very popular family, very poor, not poor, but, you know, not in this world of art and culture. So maybe she was overplaying a little bit the sophisticated ladies. That's what I was thinking of a voice. but very nice indeed.
Yes, that is such a remarkable aspect of her story, that she came from quite modest origins and was not part of this cultural elite, that she learned how to navigate in Paris, coming from the provinces, really a small village in the Alps, and was able to rise to the position of stature that she did through all of this very hard work. It took her a number of years even to be named curator. It took her into the 1950s before she was even officially named a curator in the museum system. So, okay, thank you for that. We also have a question I think is a good one for Mary Kate. There's another question from Shula Reinhardt. If you think that Rose Valland was able to succeed partly because she was in a way invisible to the German officers and the agents of plunder that were working all around her at the Jeu de Paume. What do you think about that?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think Brigitte has sort of begun to deal with this, and we have to think through her role as a woman curator or woman volunteer. As you said, Elizabeth, she was kind of strung along by the state museums for many years. She had a master's degree. She had 2 university degrees in history of art, and she was made to volunteer. I don't know if that included financial compensation or if she was sort of there building her credentials. So I think that as Brigitte's film tells us, she was maybe pitched to them as someone to help keep the lights on and show them where things were in the actual building itself. And so in that sense, her immense knowledge was probably underestimated by the Nazis. But I mean, I think that which Elizabeth, in your excellent book, you talk about this as well, and Brigitte shows an image of this recounting by Valland of being threatened by Bruno Lohse. You better watch out, these are secrets happening here, and you better not be writing this down and bringing this outside of these walls. So there must have been some sense of her abilities over time and her perceptiveness. So I think that that's a really good observation by the audience member, that there's definitely a gendered positioning of Valland, but there maybe that evolved with time in her role there.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And she used the fact that she could fly under the radar to her benefit, that the Germans weren't noticing her. And so that enabled her, with her German language skills, to keep track of the operations. So thank you for that. We really have time for perhaps one last question. We've had some folks comment on the 1960s film, The Train. And Brigitte, I love the fact that you include footage of the filming of the train in your film, and the footage that you use is in color, though the film itself is in black and white. So if our audience members have not had a chance to see that film, John Frankenheimer's 1964 film, The Train, and so it recounts this episode of works of art being prevented from reaching Germany in a fictionalized way, and we don't see Marianne's father, Alexandre, playing a role in finding the train. The film ends before that point, before the French forces arrive. And yet I could highly recommend it. I mean, there's, it is a very interesting film and raises good questions about the value of art and life. And Brigitte, you mentioned briefly how Rose Valland has been a figure in films previously, in The Train and in The Monuments Men, but not given a full picture. I wonder if you could comment a bit more about that.
This film does not speak of looting of Jewish families. That's a very strange thing, because maybe in the 60s, where they shooted the film, it was not a big question yet. And it was just a train with paintings in it. And although they use the figure of Rose Valland at the beginning of the film, they don't mention looting. And that was very strange to see that from now. And yeah, and also the pictures, the color pictures you mentioned from the shooting, that was made by the railway company, the French railway company, SNCF at that time, because they co-financed the film to see how they were so great during World War II, because they saved trains and they saved paintings. So you cannot mention what they did also with all the deportations, with all the you know, so the rule of the railway was a bit something to be asked, and maybe they use this film to show a better image, I think.
If I can just add to that, Elizabeth, they in fact did not stop the movie before or after my father. They simply suppressed the role of the Free French forces entirely and replaced it by somebody who was in the movie, in the Résistance, which dovetails with what Brigitte is saying, which was a way of uplifting the role of the Résistance in attacking and saving this train. And that in the movie, Labiche, who plays the person who stops the train, is an SNCF member who heroically, that is not at all what happened. And my father doesn't appear at all in that. So they really rewrote it. But one, it's a wonderful movie. And two, it is the first movie that was made about looted art and which brought the question of looted art without addressing where it was looted from and all of that. But it made the point that, yes, there was a massive amount of looted art. So it's important in that way.
Elizabeth, can you tell us a little bit about your center and what you do there?
Sure. Well, we heard the very clear presentation from Mary Kate on how one carries out provenance research. I really appreciated her comments walking us through an example of a couple case studies. At the University of Denver, we've created a training program so that the rising generation of curators and museum staff members can learn how to carry out this research. It's an area that really is understudied in American colleges and universities. And so we have realized that there's a real need to provide this training. We offer it as a postgraduate certificate program. We ran our first program virtually last summer, and we have plans to do so again this summer. So you can see information on this slide, how you can follow us and receive information about our upcoming training program so that we can carry on that important work and encourage provenance research today.
And what a pleasure to put together this program with you, Elizabeth. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Brigitte, our filmmaker. Thank you, our historian, Mary Kate Cleary. Thank you, gallery owner, Marianne Rosenberg, for telling us about your fascinating family history, a family that I would like to repeat was rescued by Aristides de Sousa Mendes, the hero whom we honor here. And so please, everybody, join us again next week and in the weeks to come. Thank you for a wonderful hour and be well. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.